When Charles turned 75, his daughter gave him a leather-bound journal and said, "Write whatever you want. Stories, memories, complaints. It's your book." He'd laughed and put it on the shelf, convinced he had nothing to say that wasn't already said 100 times. But a week later, on a quiet morning when the house felt bigger than it needed to be, he took it down, uncapped a pen, and began to write. What came out wasn't a story exactly. It was a reckoning. 1. The body will not cooperate the way it used to. Charles wrote about the morning he realized his knees had their own agenda. He'd been carrying groceries up the porch steps when, without warning, his right knee simply refused to bend. It wasn't pain exactly. It was like the hinge had rusted overnight. He'd stood there holding the bags, feeling foolish and unsteady. There had been other signs: the fading of muscle in his hands, the stiffness in his shoulders, the afternoon fatigue that once belonged only to sick days. At first, he'd fought it, trying to exercise the way he had at 40, pushing his limits until his back reminded him who was in charge. It took time to accept that this wasn't a battle he could win, at least not in the way he imagined. The secret wasn't fighting the decline, it was learning to work with it. Gentle stretches in the morning, walking instead of jogging, carrying fewer groceries at once, even if it meant 2 trips. Adjusting was not surrender, it was survival. 2. People will leave, sometimes all at once. He wrote about the summer when 3 friends died within 6 weeks of each other. They were the kind of friends who'd been there for decades, the voices on the other end of the phone, the coffee companions, the ones who still remembered stories no one else knew. Their absence wasn't just a loss, it was an erasure. Whole chapters of his life suddenly existed only in his own memory. And memories, he knew, faded whether you wanted them to or not. It was tempting to close in after that, to avoid making new friends who could also leave. But isolation was worse. So he'd started talking to strangers in the park, lingering at the library's community board, joining the Wednesday morning chess group even though he lost more than he won. The lesson wasn't just that people leave, it was that you have to keep opening the door anyway. Number 3, the world will keep changing without waiting for you. Charles had once prided himself on keeping up with the times. He'd read the newspaper daily, learned how to use a computer, even managed to send emails on his phone. But lately, the pace had become dizzying. The technology changed before he had time to master it. Slang sounded like code, and entire industries seemed to appear overnight. There was a moment in the grocery store when he realized half the self-checkout machine's instructions were symbols instead of words, and he stood there, baffled, until a teenager stepped in to help. For a while, he felt left behind, a relic in a world moving too fast. Then he realized the goal wasn't to master every change, it was to decide which ones mattered. He didn't need every app, every update. What mattered was being able to connect with people, to understand the news well enough to hold a conversation, to keep a sense of curiosity alive. The rest he could let pass. 4. Your role will shift in ways you might not like. Charles remembered the first time his son offered to help him carry a ladder. It wasn't a big deal, but it was the tone, gentle, careful, that hit him. Later came the driving suggestions, the raised eyebrows when he squinted at a menu. Somewhere along the line, he had shifted from provider to someone people wanted to protect. It was easy to bristle at that. Pride was a stubborn thing, but after a few incidents, a near fall on icy steps, the time he got dizzy changing a light bulb, he began to see that letting people help wasn't weakness. It was connection. It was allowing them to care for him the way he had cared for them. Still, it took practice to say thank you instead of I can do it myself. 5. Time feels different, and it's not slowing down. When Charles was young, years stretched endlessly ahead. Summer days felt like whole seasons. But somewhere around 60, time began moving like a downhill train. Months disappeared between holidays. He'd look up from the garden one day and find autumn already in the trees. The harsh truth was that there was less ahead than behind, and pretending otherwise was exhausting. So he made a choice. He would count days in depth, not length. He'd stop saving the good wine for some special occasion that might never come. He'd call friends when he thought of them instead of when things slowed down. He'd take the small trips, the short visits, the spontaneous detours. Time wasn't slowing, but he could still choose how to spend it. When Charles finished writing, he looked at the page. It wasn't neat. The handwriting sloped where his hand had cramped. But there was something liberating about seeing it laid out, the truths he'd been circling in his head for years. He closed the journal and put it on the table. That evening, his daughter came over, bringing dinner. After they'd eaten, she noticed the book and picked it up. "Can I read it?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. She read in silence, turning the pages slowly. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "You make it sound hard," she said, "but also not so bad." "It is hard," Charles said, "but it's not the enemy. You just have to stop pretending it's not happening." She closed the journal gently. "You know, you've always taught me how to live. I think now you're teaching me how to age." Charles smiled. "That's just another word for living." Later, when she left, he sat by the window with a cup of tea. Outside, the streetlights came on, one by one, as if the night were unfolding on cue. He thought about the list in his journal, not as a record of what was lost, but as a map of how to keep going. The body would slow, people would go, the world would change, his role would shift, time would run. But there was still beauty in every part of it, if he chose to see it. And he did, every single day he could.